Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. Stumble, stumble. As you guys know, I'm Kirsten Nelson. I'm a professional horse trainer, and with me, my good friend Deborah Merrow, certified Alexander Technique instructor. And today's topic is tensegrity. What is it? Why do we care what it is? And how does it help us? Oh, I gotta write
Mm,
that down. Those were good questions.
yeah, at least you're recording it, so if
I
you have
know,
to go
right?
back, you can write it down.
But I know we're gonna get distracted,
We
so
always
I'm
do.
gonna jot those down. What did I say? What is it? What is it? Is the first question.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? Why is it even important to us?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe how do we use it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another phrase we came up with before we started recording, it might apply, is that network of small things I liked,
Yes, I think tensegrity helps us
and how that
see.
involves Mm-hmm.
It helps us see that the body is a connected network of small
Right.
things. Yeah. And so it's just like you and I are both on our small things, our
Small little
laptops,
islands.
right? But we're connected, like all personal computers are connected through this internet,
Right. So we can access our small things, but we also have access to the whole thing.
right?
Yeah.
And I think, well, we'll go over what tensegrity is and what it means. Um, But I think the important part of it, if you guys want to stick with us through this podcast, because it'll take a little bit to unpack, but the importance of understanding it is sort of what you and I have talked about before. If we have pain in our knee, it's not
Mm.
always the problem. The root cause of that problem is not necessarily the knee,
Exactly.
right? And so looking at the body as a network of parts that's connected with soft
Network
tissue.
of small things. Yep.
Yeah. And so it helps us understand the whole picture because when we go down the path of science and a lot of medicine, we
Mhm.
cut things apart. We cut the whole into
We
smaller and
dissect.
smaller
We
pieces.
dissect things.
And then we look
Hmm.
for the pathology within a piece and surmise, oh, that's the problem. But the pathology in one piece could be the result of another piece of the network not quite doing its job. And when we're looking at lameness, when we're looking at mechanical lameness, painful
Mm.
lameness, behavior, um, performance, all of those things, we have to kind of look at the pieces, but always step back and look at the whole. And I think that's where, when we use the model of tensegrity to better understand the systems within a body, it really helps our minds look at things in a different way. Same thing, different perspective.
Right. It's
So,
not, we look at, if we could look at it in isolation, but then broaden our perspective,
right,
I think we might be more, what do I want to say, perceptive to what the actual cause is, instead of treating the symptom,
right.
looking for, the actual cause of the problem.
And even if we look at a tree, we could zero in on a leaf or a branch or the trunk or the root system, right? But we have to step back to see how is the whole tree, right? Because we don't
Hmm.
know if there's an issue, if the issue in the leaf is, resulting in this root problem or vice versa.
Right,
So it's like we can zero in on any single part, but we also need to step back and look at the whole system.
right. It was
So,
just, we were talking before we were recording. I've just got lab work back in on my big mare, and I just noticed she just wasn't acting right. And looking at the big picture of her just not acting right, I did a plethora of lab work and, finding information that way, why, and looking at the body, but also applying medical knowledge to come up with what could I do overall.
Right. Or
Right.
just checking the blood. I go,
Right.
that's part of the system. It's an easy diagnostic tool to
Right.
go, is something amiss? Is
Yeah.
something not right internally? And does the blood work reflect that?
Yeah.
Right. Or
And
the med.
that's an easy place to start. It's costly, but I firmly believe the older our horses get, the more we need to maybe every
Check
6
in.
months be checking in on certain things, just
Hmm.
like older humans, you
Yes.
know, just to stay up on top of things.
Yeah, because things change. So let's tuck into what tensegrity is, because that's a new word to a lot of people.
Mm,
And it was developed by, the word was sort of coined by Buckminster Fuller, I think back in the 60s, maybe even the 50s, who was a genius mathematician and I think engineer. But Buckminster Fuller coined the term tensegrity, which is a blending of the words tension or tensile and integrity. And what it basically describes is a structure that is a different kind of structure in its relationship to gravity. A
mm,
tensegrity structure maintains its integrity or its stability or its shape or form with a different system than, say, how we would build a house, right? So
right.
in a and let's just look at actual buildings before we
Good
even
idea.
take that model into bodies, because that's a little easier to understand. So when we build a house, we have our support beams, and the support beams hold the integrity of the structure together. So the foundation we pour with concrete and the support beams that get put in place first, those have what are called a constant alignment to gravity, right? Or they have a constant, it's a constant relationship with gravity.
Hmm.
They
Yeah, I
don't
agree.
move,
Right.
right? And then we build the walls internally and externally around that structure that never changes its relationship to gravity. It's always a constant alignment, vertical, horizontal, angular, whatever it is, it's constant. And that was kind of the old model of bodies
Mm.
that were built like that. And the new model of looking at anatomy, functional anatomy, is more the idea of a tensegrity structure. So what is a tensegrity structure? A tensegrity structure is like a suspension bridge,
Hmm.
or those homes that are round in shape. They call them geodesic domes.
Domes, the domes.
The domes, or even like an igloo, right? Even though it's built on blocks, which are ice blocks, which are compression elements, it's held together with tension by the shape it's put in,
And that's a good point to that word tension because we may have a real negative thought,
especially with bodies.
yeah, around the word tension, which I
Hmm.
don't know what the exact definition is, but tension to me is like the right amount of tone.
It's the appropriate amount of
Yeah.
tone,
Yeah.
right? And what is tensile strength, right? That in engineering, that describes the appropriate flexibility of a
Mm.
component, right? So, in other words, like if we think of a rubber band has a certain tensile strength. So, if we overstretch its capacity, it
Hmm.
breaks. But there's a huge
Mm.
range. If it's completely relaxed, it has zero tension, but it
Right.
still has enough tension that it retains its form.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we stretch it and let it snap back, we're altering the tension or the tensile, right, um, energy of that rubber band. And so excessive tension is sort of, or maximum tension is going to the tensile strength of that rubber band. And if you add more, it snaps and breaks. It
Right.
fails, right? It fails. But if we stay within that range of its inherent tensile capacity, we can stretch it and let it snap back, right? And
It's kind
that's,
of, I'm thinking like range of motion.
yeah. So in a
Yeah.
body, that's
Mm-hmm.
all your soft tissues.
Mm-hmm.
So whether we're talking tendons, ligaments, fascia, muscle,
Mm-hmm.
all the soft tissues of the body, we can think of like a bazillion different size rubber bands,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or if you have a really thick rubber band versus a thin rubber band, you have a different capacity of stretchiness, right?
And if you look at if you're comparing it to the body, is the body symmetrical? Or do we have some tensile loads that are too much and some that are not enough?
Exactly. So if we just
Yeah.
go to a non-body structure like a geodesic dome, a dome or even archways, like this was a big evolution in sort of in building and architecture and human design for, humans designing buildings was the mathematics involved in building an arch or something that doesn't have a support beam underneath it
Well,
to
mm-hmm.
like span a distance. Now we're talking about how the forces are interacting in order to create stability, right? So in a geodesic dome, there's like little metal triangles,
Mm-hmm.
right, that all connect together that are the the compression. There's in a tensegrity structure, it's built out of two things: compression elements and adjustable or adaptable elements, right? So the compression elements have an adjustable, how do we say, either a congruent or a flexible relationship to gravity.
Mm-hmm.
And that flexibility, like a building, we cement those support beams in concrete so they don't move,
So I know.
right? But like on an earthquake code building, or say like the Golden Gate Bridge is a suspension bridge, those big up and down vertical pieces have a little bit of wiggle room, right? In order to adapt to the forces of the water, the wind, earthquakes, whatever's impacting it, because the cables have a tensile adaptability.
Yeah, and I use that a lot, the Golden Gate Bridge, because people can visualize, oh, yeah,
Picture
I
it.
know what that looks like. And I always say, well, you've got the framework, the
Hmm.
structure, but then you've also got the guy wires. And I usually ask, if you cut an inch out of one guy wire, would you agree with me that that affects the whole bridge?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's how a tensegrity system is so different
right.
than what we would call traditional structures,
Hmm.
right? Or a constant relationship to gravity structure. And where this becomes really important is looking at the impact of forces on the structure.
Hmm.
So, like on our house, if we get a snow load on the northwest corner of the roof, right, and that support beam starts to become compromised, then the failure of the building, right, where we get a snow load that leaks through the roof or collapses the roof, or in a hurricane, right, where the building blows apart, is where that wind force was the greatest or that snow load became the greatest. That's exactly where the failure of that structure is going to occur. And we still look at bodies the same way. But bodies are not that. Bodies are more of a tensegrity structure.
Mm-hmm.
So our skeleton, our hard tissues, the bones, and even the joints have an adaptable relationship to gravity, but they maintain their integrity, right? The bones,
Yes.
like once the bones are done growing, they don't keep growing,
Right.
right? The bones are the bones. The length and the density and the size and all of that, the bones settle into a constant compression structure, part of the structure,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then the soft tissues are like the rubber bands.
Mm-hmm.
Those are adaptable for the whole life of the structure, right? So if we go back to, say, the Golden Gate Bridge, the wind force that's hitting that bridge is distributed throughout the entire bridge,
Right. That's a good one. I like that
right?
one.
And so instead of if the bridge fails, then either one of those compression elements took a head-on force, that would be like us breaking our arm, right? That impact force broke a bone, or like the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland, right? That bridge failed because a massive force called a boat ran into one of
Mm-hmm.
the one ran into the compression element of one of the support beams that
Mm-hmm.
holds the bridge up. But that force went throughout the bridge,
Right.
right? So that pylon didn't fail, but the other parts of the bridge in the weakest link failed.
Right.
Does that make
And
sense?
no, I love that because it goes back to your knee theory.
My knee theory, that's
Yeah.
your knee theory.
Well, way back when you had knee pain
Oh, yeah.
and that's that symptom, but that wasn't the cause. So, you know,
Right.
just treating the pain element, just narrowing your vision to look at that usually doesn't take care of the problem.
Right.
It
Because
manifests somewhere else.
yeah, because if we look at that very specific issue in my body, like this bridge failure in Maryland, the impact force or the ship that hit the concrete pylon was around the left side of my lumbar spine, my
Yeah.
basically my low back on the left side, but the pain or the failure or the part that was going to take the brunt of that impact force was my right knee,
Mm.
right? Or like you said, if you cut 1 inch out of those guy wires on a suspension bridge, all of a sudden, the impact force going through the whole bridge
Hmm.
could twist some of those support elements, some of those constant compression elements could now twist and distort because the tension elements were changed.
And
So one
there was a
affects the other,
there was
right?
a study done many years ago that I read, wait, 20 some years ago when I was doing massage, that for every inch that they cut into the fascia, you lose 20% compression load in that area
In a body.
in a body. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's huge because we're all, and I'm sure you could say this about horses, we are a closed compression system.
We are a closed, I would say, just for the sake of clarity in this conversation, because it's confusing enough, we are a closed system, and the best model for looking at the body is a closed tensegrity system,
Hmm.
right? And so internally, the forces we're dealing with is that relationship between the compression elements,
Hmm.
the skeleton, and the tension elements, soft tissues, tendons, ligaments, fascia, muscle, right? So that internal relationship is one
Mm-hmm.
part of the equation, but then we have external forces also
Mm-hmm.
impacting the system in entirety, right? So same thing when we ride a horse, the horse's internal coordination is going to generate, is either going to manage the forces of motion well
Mm-hmm.
or poorly. So when we say
Good point.
our horse has a crappy trot, I go, our horse has a really bad trot, really bad canter. What that means to me in my head is that internal coordination between the compression elements and the tension elements is not where it should be. It's not in its
The
ideal
relationship
relationship.
isn't right.
And that's what you just brought up earlier. You kind of were a little bit ahead of me, was if some rubber bands are stretched to capacity, then other rubber bands might not even have any tension. They might be
Right.
just
They're
sitting
not.
there lax,
Mm-hmm.
right? So our ideal coordination in a body is sort of, even though the bones are flexible, let's go back to our axial skeleton of the skull, the spine, the pelvis, the rib cage, and go whether we're laying down, sitting in a chair, standing, swimming, or in on the moon, right? That internal sort of alignment of our compression elements just through our spine, pelvis, skull, rib cage is going to determine how much tension we need in all the different muscles that support it, the tendons and ligaments that support it, or the fascia that supports it, right? Whether or not it maintains its internal alignment, its internal integrity has to do with the internal tension elements, or it affects the internal tension elements, right? So when we have muscle pain, sometimes that's our body letting us know that the internal skeletal alignment is a little out of whack because it's
Yeah.
making some rubber bands really work hard. Some muscles have to really work hard because the alignment of the bones is not quite where it needs to be according to its own design.
And I get the most horse related injuries from people with mucking. It cracks me
Yeah,
up because it's repetitive. We usually only use one side,
yeah,
and we always think there's a time element. So putting all that together, it's like left-handed, right-handed. You're going to have a misuse if you constantly only use one side of your body.
right.
It's like the
Exactly.
rubber
Or
bands are too tight on one side and not used on the other side. So balancing that out is important to the tensegrity of the model.
right. And so the blueprint of a body sort of shows us where the compression elements belong and the ideal amount of tension, not too much, not too little. To me, that's what I call muscle tone,
Yeah, I
right?
like I like tone better than tension. It just doesn't have the negative undertones.
Exactly.
Yeah, in our thought process, we've just been taught what the word tension is a negative thing.
Right. And sort of like music, striking the right tone
Mm,
is, it sounds good, it feels good.
mm-hmm,
Where when it's not quite the right tone, that's what we call tension.
mm-hmm.
But we can also have a laxity of tone and
Yes.
weaken, right? So we can have too much, too little. But when we have the ideal amount of tension, the whole system sort of operates as this, like I said, network of small things,
Network of small things. I like that.
right? So it's not
Everybody's talking to each other.
everybody's talking to each other. And so when we're dealing with external forces or internal forces, the way the network works is the difference between ease of motion and
Mm,
struggle. It's a difference in our
Mm-hmm.
horses between sound and unsound,
Mm-hmm.
or having them feel so good in work that they look forward to work rather than, doing
Mm-hmm.
the funeral dirge on the way to the arena. Yeah. And I think we've slipped into answering some of the questions of what is it, why is it important, and how do we use it? And I think that the question of how we use it is that really ties back to what we've talked about with postures and frames
Mm-hmm.
and balance, because every time our horse changes, even if we just look at the neck muscles alone, which is the
Right.
most obvious part of the horse for the human eye to see changes, right? If we look at those neck muscles, whether they're lengthening or shortening, whether they're bulging out or whether they look really weak and wobbly, right? Whether it looks like a noodle or it looks like a fence post. Those,
Mm.
all of those things are describing muscle tone, muscle use. And if we just look at how the neck is used, we start to realize that's not in isolation. And the whole idea of framing horses is like, if we could just get that neck in the right place, somehow the whole body is going to be perfect. And
Sorry.
I go, the only truth behind that is with every change we can visually see through the use of the neck muscles, right? Or the use of the neck bones, the use of the skull and the neck bones. Yes, that is either to me, it indicates that there's a bigger change, but a more subtle change that we can't visually see
Mm-hmm.
as easily through the core, the spine, the pelvis, and the deeper muscles. So those outer neck muscles that are easy for us to see a change means the whole system is changing that. So I guess it sounds kind of logical from a very simplistic point of view that if we change the use of the neck, we change the use of the torso. Yes and no. Yes and no. I can't say that's entirely wrong, but for the horse, the neck is the most highly mobile part of the body, right? So they have this long neck without a leg underneath it and this big heavy head. And if we manipulate that coordination, yes, we make changes to the
Mm-hmm.
torso, but are they the changes we want? Because what we
That's the
consider
question. Mm-hmm.
the perfect headset is really, it's much more complicated. The spine and the pelvis have to establish that right amount of tone in the deeper core muscles before the outer result is this perfect headset.
And I think it goes back to that network of small things. If our thinking is if I just get the neck right, everything will fall in, it just doesn't make sense to me. As a tensegrity model, if you're looking at the Golden Gate Bridge, if I take some of the guy wires and I pull them real tight and think that that's going to hold the bridge, you
Right.
get what I'm saying?
I do, because in that same example, it would be like one of the big vertical supports of the bridge is leaning.
Right. And
And
that's okay.
so and so you're going to try to manually shorten a guy wire in order to correct that leaning massive support part of the bridge. And I go, it kind
Meanwhile,
of
the rest of it
works.
is screaming.
You could say that's one way to be effective, but that's not a very efficient way to do it,
It's not a long-term solution.
right? And so in reverse, what we would do that would make more sense to the bridge is we would use our strategy to make that support system go from leaning back to upright. And that would also change the amount of tension and tone through the wires.
And that would all have to be adjusted all the way out, broadcasted. Huge.
Right. So if we look at, like, your example is great. I have a leaning, I have a leaning compression element, one of
Right?
those big vertical supports with pylons underneath it that makes up the vertical components of the bridge. And you're right. One strategy could be I'm going to go out there and play with the guy wires until it straightens up the middle, right? Or another strategy could be I'm going to try to correct the middle and let the guy wires that have been overworking relax a little bit back to their normal amount of tension.
Mhm,
Because if one of those compression elements is leaning left, all the guy wires on the right are at maximum capacity of tension, and all the guy wires on the left are slack, not enough
mhm,
tension, right? So I could adjust the tension if that was easier to do, or I could adjust the compression element and let the guy wires change tension automatically. So as soon as that compression element of that vertical support is truly vertical again, then without addressing the guy wires, the tension restores on the slack side and reduces on the tight side and restores its ideal amount of tone, right? And so that's kind of what we're looking at with bodies. So taking that bendy neck and pulling it in with the leverage of a bit is like adjusting maybe the guy wires,
mhm,
but I don't think it's an efficient way to work with a tensegrity system. I go, if we address where the primary compression elements are, right? So in other words, if we look at a body, and this happens all the time, this was my knee issue. My spine was in a unconscious but very habitual right twist,
mhm. Just a little torque.
just a little bit of a
Just a little
twist,
torque.
right? That wasn't necessarily visible, but
Right.
over time, that little bit of a right twist with a tiny invisible amount of right lateral bend through my spine was creating tight guy wires down
Mhm,
the left side of my axial skeleton, right? So with my spine twisted and slightly bent right that nobody could see,
mhm.
couldn't see it at all. I couldn't see it. I didn't see it in a mirror, right? Maybe I would see it on an x-ray, didn't check. But that little habit or pattern of how the central compression element was arranged created a lot of tightness on the left side of the spine and a lot of excess force, a lot of laxity on the right side of the spine, right? And so then the force of motion was constantly being pushed away from the left to the right. So my body weight was too little on the left, too much on the right,
Mhm,
and the weakest link of the chain,
mhm.
right? The small piece within the whole network that decided it couldn't hold up to that was the right knee.
And that's real important to share because, granted, horses do injure their legs, but that's like looking at your knee.
And I think the difference is it chronic and
Mm,
idiopathic? Idiopathic means we
mhm,
don't know. That's all it means is unknown source, idiopathic, unknown source, right? To the right knee. So getting an MRI, getting an X-ray, and the doctor tells me there's nothing wrong, but I still have pain.
and that's that whole 6 weeks, pain course I took, with Tim Cacciatore, is that the medical model is there has to be something on an X-ray or an MRI to cause pain, and it's
Right.
simply not true. We're finding out there's a big psycho-emotional movement component that goes through the fascia system that can cause pain that we cannot mark on an X-ray.
Right. And that's why that idea, looking at our body and our horse's body like a tensegrity structure, is most important when it comes to analyzing failure.
Oh, I like that.
And
Yeah.
we could say failure equals pain,
Mm-hmm.
or failure equals falling over, right?
Just a
Or
dysfunction. Yeah.
some kind of problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of like that example of if the snow load or the wind force is impacting a specific part of a structure, like a house, then the failure is going to be right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in a tensegrity system, even when we fall off a horse, we don't necessarily break the bone that we fell on. We might
That's
break
true.
a different bone, or we might have pain somewhere else in the body other than the place where we received the greatest impact.
Right. And it's kind of like anytime all us horse people can relate, we get an injury. We do some sort of compensation pattern. And
Ex-
we can get sore from that because we've not used ourselves that way before.
Right. So you can have a single impact, like fall off your horse, or you can have small repetitive
Yeah.
wear and tear,
Hmm.
small repetitive impacts, like mucking with your back twisted,
Yeah, that
right?
yeah, not
Um,
not conscious thought at that point usually.
right. And those are the types of forces that start to create the problems to the system.
Hmm.
And so when we have what we call idiopathic painful lameness in the horse is in pain, but our way of thinking of the body means medically, the vet
Hmm.
goes and looks for pathology
Hmm.
from the hoof up,
Right.
right? But sometimes there's no pathology
Right.
and it becomes a mystery. We inject it anyways, we give pain relief so the horse can function, but the impact might have been small repetitive misuse through any one of the vertebra of the spine,
Anywhere. Yeah.
right? There's a whole lot of them too, right? Or through just something as simple as a habitual twist, a habitual bend that's not really there for any particular reason, perfectly changeable. It just became the habit of the body.
A great example is my big mare when for almost a year that on and off left leg lameness, just three-legged lame and couldn't find anything till I
Couldn't
had her
figure it out.
couldn't figure it out until I brought her down to Florida and actually the vet we used there said, "Well, I think it's in her neck." And we
Yeah,
both looked at each other and went, well, that makes total sense. Why didn't we look there?"
yeah. And there was some pathology in the neck,
Hmm.
arthritis, right? So, arthritis, anything that ends in itis means inflammation. So, arthritis is there's too much force
Hmm.
going through that part of the body. So, the body produces more bone in order to stabilize that small part of the network, right?
Yeah.
But that small part of the network is affecting the function of the whole system.
Yep. Obvious with her, as big as she is.
Yeah.
And that it all had to do with her use, how
Yeah.
she was using her body.
So that small, like if we look at the vertebra of the neck as part of the central compression element of the body,
Hmm.
a small misuse in the neck to the point that the body said, hey, the muscles aren't doing their job here. So the bone's going to produce more bone to try
Hmm.
to stabilize that compression element of the whole body. That in turn, over time, leads to it's not right, so it's going to create a pain issue. But where did the pain issue manifest? Pretty far from the neck. It
Yeah.
showed up
She looked
what,
like she was abscess lame. I mean, just
yeah,
three-legged lame.
yeah, but after blocking her, no change, no
Nothing.
pathology, no reason, no nothing throughout the whole leg,
Mhm.
right? And so that vet was very wise to go, okay, what might be the next closest part of the body that could be affecting the front legs and the neck? Yeah, absolutely. And so I find long term, lack of performance, bad behavior, and idiopathic painful lameness can all be the result of long-term small dysfunctional habits in the compression elements of the skeletal coordination.
Welcome to the Alexander world.
Yeah. In a nutshell, that's
In
it.
a nutshell.
Yeah. So even my horse, who has the pathology of navicular changes and,
Mhm.
arthritis in P2, P3, which is, or P1, P2, and P3, ring bone, that doesn't mean just because he has the pathology now that he also can't be sound. So in reverse, even though the pathology is there in your mare's neck, the arthritis is there. The
Right.
arthritis might always be there on every x-ray, but the
Exactly.
difference is my horse head bobbing lame, or can I trot my horse and he's comfortable enough to trot and work and be ridden?
Mhm.
That is true.
It
But the
is true.
only way to rehab your horse and my horse with he had, changes in the feet that were creating pain, right? To the point he was head bobbing lame, but through the work over the whole system, restoring the alignment of his spine, right? Reducing any twisting or bending of the spine, and then getting his muscles built up to the point that he could control his own body weight through his back and his hindquarters as part of the system. He learned how to keep his own body weight and reduce the concussive forces to his front legs. So as soon
Right.
as those concussive forces were alleviated, even with the pathology still there, there's no pain. That's the
And that's what's
importance.
cool about horses is they don't have the placebo effect or the thought, you
Right.
know? So
Right.
so then you know if it's working or if it's not.
Exactly.
It's so much easier than working with people.
Yeah. And what's hard with bodies is the rehabilitation or the repair or
Mhm.
the restoration of the mechanical system only happens through work and by changing habits of motion,
Exactly.
habits of coordination, right? So the repair job can take some time because you have to change the coordination and then build the muscular strength in the right
Right.
tone without too
And that's
much tension or not enough tension.
that's why I got into the Alexander work. As a body worker, I could fix people on the table, but as soon as they got up and started going back into their patterns of movement,
Yeah,
it messed up the tensegrity model again.
right.
So really, we between you and me, we know we have to refurbish the body and movement.
Which is changing neural pathways
Hmm.
related to habits of movement.
Yes,
And that's not a quick fix, but
not at all.
it's a permanent fix.
Hmm.
So, the alternative with my horse that has navicular and ring bone are these very expensive treatments. First you go through the expensive diagnostics,
Yes,
then you go through really expensive treatments, and without fail, over time, those same very expensive treatments work for shorter and shorter periods of time before you have to repeat them because you're breaking the pain cycle, but you're not addressing the habit of movement that's creating the concussive force in the first place.
the habit.
So over
Hmm.
time, the body needs more and more and more pain management just to function because the coordination of movement is causing the problem.
Exactly. Bingo.
Hmm.
Same in people.
Yep. Yeah. And I go, not just because I'm cheap, but because I also want a long-term solution.
Gee.
I took the time with this horse to figure out his patterns, change his habits, rebuild the use of the body. That's not for everybody because it can take time. It's a whole new aspect of riding and working with horses that we have to learn about because it's not a big part of our horse industry. We'd
That's
rather
true.
just relieve the pain and keep going to the show. But either our horse's entire system is being weakened or strengthened whenever we're working them. So we can sort of choose by how we work with our horse that we're going to alter the coordination to restore where those compression elements should be and how much tone is in those tensile elements, the
Hmm.
tension elements. Too much or too little is going to have a weakening effect on the whole system over
Yeah.
time. Yeah, so bodies are really complex, but when we look at it through the lens of tensegrity as a body, actually it gets more simple because we don't have to know the details all the time of which small part of the network needs the
Right.
repair. We can kind of let the body itself figure that out,
Right.
but we can focus on sort of getting the biggest constant compression elements restored and then let
Yes.
all the soft tissues kind of adapt around that. And it may be a very slow process. Some horses go through that process a lot faster, but each body kind of has a threshold of change that you can't rush. I go
I
for some
agree. Yeah.
people, becoming a marathon runner, it takes a whole lot less time compared to others.
Hmm. Yeah. It just depends, as all my good teachers have said.
Yeah. And you guys can Google if you've listened to this podcast and you're still a little confused about tensegrity. It's spelled, I should think about it. How's it spelled?
I gotta write it.
Yeah. Tensegrity, tensegrity,
Yep.
tensile integrity.
Yep.
And if you Google it, you'll get a whole bunch of pictures popping up that show these weird little toys made out of sticks and rubber bands, like popsicle sticks and rubber bands. And you can even make one yourself, right? And so, just to kind of clarify it in the simplest of terms, if we took a pile of popsicle sticks and rubber bands, if we were going to build a house or a constant compression structure, then we would have to get those sticks, popsicle sticks, stabilized first in order to put the rubber bands around it and have it maintain its integrity. If we just took the popsicle sticks and the rubber bands and we attach them randomly to each other with one rubber band between two popsicle sticks and so on, it takes a shape that then is a adjustable, movable structure. It could be, instead of just being vertical, it could be horizontal. You could lay it this
Mhm.
way or you could lay it that way, but the inherent integrity of the structure doesn't change,
Right.
right? And that's why bodies don't fall. Like if I tried to lay my house on its side, it's going to destroy the structure, right? If I try to lay my body from upright to sitting to laying down, it doesn't destroy the structure.
Right.
That's the difference between a constant compression model and an integrity model or tensegrity model. And so you guys can Google it. There's a bazillion videos and pages of
Hmm.
information about tensegrity. And if you really want to geek out, then Stephen Levin, Levine, he has a website called Biotensegrity. And
Ah.
he has written multiple research papers on this. He kind of coined the term biotensegrity, and his website is fascinating because he posts all of his published papers there for you to read. And he talks about the math behind it, that if we keep looking at bodies like the way we build our house, the math all of a sudden doesn't make any sense.
Right.
We wouldn't be able to do what we could do, right? And he goes, this is a much better model. And I think he was an orthopedic surgeon specializing in the spine that he kind of started to write about to go, this is really the central element of the body that everything organizes around.
And that's pretty much, as an Alexander, from our perspective, is what we think. the limbs will take care of themselves if you have correct function of the spine.
Yeah. And I will put his name and website in the
Oh, good.
show notes or in the more description box below this video so you guys can geek out and has see what he has to say. Fascinating guy, explains tensegrity, the concept of tensegrity very, very well, and even the history of it that traces back to Buckminster Fuller. So I this was truly a horse geeks episode.
Right
But
up
I
our
think
alley.
it's important even for the sort of, pleasure rider, casual horse owner, because
Hmm.
when it comes to managing our horse's health and well-being, it's really an important concept with how we start to look at all the different elements that affect our horse's health and well-being,
Hmm.
right? Those are the outside influences, but maybe there's an inside internal influence that's making the whole system kind of break down slowly with wear and tear or find resiliency and
Right.
getting better with age.
I like that.
The older I get, the more important that gets to me.
Me too.
Yeah. No, and watching my dad in his 90s recover, between 85 and 90, watching him recover from substantial open heart surgery and a head injury that, created a brain bleed, and how even at that late age in our lives, he actively started to change some of his habits regarding movement as well as diet or
Mhm.
what we call exercise. But it was how he was exercising that
Right.
with the guidance of a very good personal trainer has really restored his health in ways that are not what we expect at that age.
And that's so critical. We
Hmm.
we only get one body,
That's right.
so
Yeah.
use it well.
Use it well. Use it to the best of your ability.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Welcome to the new subscribers. We love that more people are interested in what we're talking about, that we're not the only ones. So thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for commenting. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.